to this computer. Okay, cool. So, I'm gonna have everyone kind of just think about this for a minute. I'm gonna provide no more context intentionally. I think what I want everyone to do is just think about this question and see if you can group your actions that you take into your life into different categories and just maybe just spend the next minute or so thinking about what motivates you. Yeah, add this in the chat as well. It's stop sharing. Okay. So now, does anyone have any initial thoughts? What have they thought of so far? Yeah, Trent, go ahead.
Yeah, so just thinking about what motivates the majority of my actions, I'd honestly have to say I think probably an envisioned desirable future.
Mm,
A lot of the actions I take in the moment are part of a plan, be it a shorter or longer term plan to get to some desired outcome.
okay. And that outcome itself, would you say that it's dictated? Is it something that's solely about you? Is it you in relation to maybe other people around you, your family, friends? Like, what does that look like?
I think it varies, dependent on circumstance. It's
Mm,
kind of a generalized approach I take, I think, to a lot of things where I'll make plans and then do things like in the present, largely in advance, such that I have XYZ in the future. Like, for example, right now, these past 3 days, I've been making a lasagna, which I mentioned earlier, for my friends with the desired outcome of that, hey, then in like a week from now, when we do Secret Santa, I'll have had this like frozen and then I can give everyone a homemade lasagna when I'm more busy at that time. Whereas like right now, I have free time. In the future, I won't. Or during that time, I won't have as much free time to like cook for them. So a lot of my actions, whether they're specifically me doing something for me or me doing something for other people or other stuff, are largely with focus on a desired outcome or future. In this case, providing lasagna, or in other cases, again, like some goal which I want to fulfill for myself or others, if that makes sense.
No, that makes total sense. So there's a certain intentionality. There's that with every action that you commit, tied in with something that's going to happen in the future. With I'd say with a sizable amount of actions. Is that fair to say?
Yes, not all actions. There are some things which I do just for the sake of like enjoying them in the present, but I
Mhm.
would still say that the majority of my actions are future oriented.
Got you. That makes sense. Does anybody else have anything to share? Anything else to share? Yes, Ellie.
Yeah, so um, a lot of thoughts came up for me, and I feel like there's two categories of actions in general, I think,
Mhm.
that I take in my life. One category is things that are purposeful and that I intentionally set out to do. And then the other category is like not necessarily something I specifically went like, oh, this is the specific purpose for me to go and do these things, but more so because I'm part of groups or cultures or institutions that like this is what needs to be done, and so it will be done. Or like just even Thanksgiving as a holiday, like I didn't decide that this was going to happen, and I didn't decide these were going to be the days off, but these just so happen to be the days off that we can take. And then, so in that sense, like I feel like that didn't have a inherent like internal purpose that I put onto it, but
Mhm.
was just actions that came about in my life that occurred. And then the more purpose-driven actions, I think I broke down in there are the things that are more present oriented and then the things that are more future oriented, and they kind of combine in that some things are kind of shaped by both present and future, and that I may be doing something that's a goal that would help me towards like a future version of my life that I want, but that's still influenced by that current day circumstances or how I'm feeling and like all those present day things.
Mhm.
And it summarizes into the life I want to live both in the present and what will stack up towards the continuation of my life.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So I think there's like this recurring theme here where you have like actions taken with the intent of just being in the present versus actions with the intent of like some future goal. And then one other thing that I kind of heard as well was like kind of like almost like a sense of responsibility with some actions. So like some actions are taken with like the goal of like you're operating in a greater society. Maybe it's like in your family, or maybe it's like with a friend group and you're having your friendsgiving and it's like I got to bring this, and that's like part of my responsibility right now. So there's like this element of responsibility that kind of plays into your actions as well. Cool, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing, Ellie. Anybody else? Yeah, Nishta, go ahead.
I think something that came up for me was um, also like a category of actions that I might be doing in the present that actually counterintuitively are, in a way, giving me present security, but actually holding me back from getting to future goals. Like, in a way, self-sabotage. I feel like that's something that we talk about so much nowadays in a lot of like kind of like therapy speak or a lot of self-help books.
Mhm.
Um, but I found that to almost be like an interesting third category is like, are we doing quick present actions that are giving us a sense of maybe like quick security or false security or instant dopamine, but
Mhm.
in turn, those could actually be holding us back from the future goals. And on some level, we know that, or on some level, it's like a subconscious action. And this can be as small as literally scrolling through your phone at night before you're going to sleep. And you've been saying for like a month, I'm going to turn off my phone, I'm going to put it away, and I'm not going to scroll on it. You know, something as small as that to something as large as like every time you say that you're going to start a goal, like, I don't know, getting a gym membership. And I mean, New Year's resolutions are right around the corner. And
Yeah.
then finding a convenient way to make excuses. So even like present actions that could be basically driven off of fear is kind of a way I created a third category for that. So it was interesting to just think about.
That's interesting. And would you say that all those activities that you'd categorize in that group are driven by like are they innately selfish in some way or form?
Yeah, I would say like they definitely could be categorized that way because again, like the motives for doing it could be different, right? Like the motives could be if you're doing it out of fear, this is something that's giving you instant like familiarity or instant security. But in turn, I guess that is selfish in a way. And that could be used in a different connotation of the word because typically I feel like the connotation of selfish is
Yeah,
something
yeah.
that's positive. But yeah, I guess that could be used for like the literal definition of the word.
Yeah. So maybe like self dash ish.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Perfect. That's good to know. Anybody else? Okay. Awesome. Then let's move on then. So the like, sorry, let me just share my screen again. So yeah, for me, I reflected on this, and I think there's, as everyone here mentioned, there's so many different ways where you can break this down. And I was really interested in hearing how everyone kind of formulated it. So when I kind of looked at my actions, I kind of broke it down into like I generalize this into like three types of almost like intention behind the action. So one of them was like actions driven by the ego, which is like the sense of self. The second one that I thought of was driven by duty and responsibility, and I know that Ellie was someone that kind of alluded to that duty responsibility portion. And then third being actions driven by just the pure greater good. So like the ego, and I think that there is like a certain amount of like overlap with actions, right? Some action could be driven by a sense of duty, but it could be fulfilling to the ego. And I'll talk more about what the ego is, but I think a very easy definition is just like your sense of self. So it's not necessarily like all ego is like ego is the enemy or ego is all bad. And I think that's maybe a little bit more of a spiritual connotation when we talk about ego as opposed to like a regular connotation when we talk about ego is like, oh, that person has such a big ego. So I think I kind of split it up in those three ways when I thought about it. So driven by the self, driven by a certain amount of duty and responsibility, and that's interacting in a society, and then the greater good. And I think it's like the scope of each of those kind of like starts to expand and expand and expand, right? Where like ego obviously is just you. Duty, responsibility oftentimes is in relation to people around you. And then the greater good is kind of just like society or the world as a whole. One thing that I've reflected on, and I'm curious if people have thought in the same way, is that I often think that we act without like a real awareness of why we do things. So I'll give you an example. So imagine a scenario where you go and you get a gift for someone. And in your mind, if you're purchasing a gift for them, then the intention may be that, okay, you know what? I'm purchasing this gift because I want to maybe wish them a happy birthday or celebrate something about them or just make them feel loved. And in let's say you give the gift and they don't like that gift or they don't give you the reaction that you're kind of looking for. And in that moment, naturally that the reaction that we experience internally is kind of like, oh shit, like damn, like I feel kind of hurt now, right? That they didn't like the gift. And sometimes we may even have like naturally some complaints about it and we may talk to the other person about it and say like, oh, like I brought you a gift out of this like pure intention, right? And I got you this gift, but then you didn't react the way that I expected. But in that instance, it's like something that I've thought about personally is that like I'm kind of the intention isn't necessarily pure if I'm expecting a reaction, right? If I'm expecting that the person that is giving the gift, or like if I'm giving the gift and I'm expecting that person should react a certain way because I'm giving the gift, then it's not a selfless action. It's like selfish in a different way or form. Maybe not in the material lens is it selfish, but maybe in like on like an emotional level, and how we the emotions we want to feel. It's a little bit selfish. And I don't think that's obviously like part of being in a society. That's not necessarily inherently wrong, but or like a right or wrong reaction. It's just the way that we react. But I feel like there's like a connotation about selflessness there, where like giving a gift should is selfless, but it isn't. So maybe a question I then have for everyone else that's just been thinking about is, do you have scenarios in your life where you kind of think of things as like, oh, this is something that's selfless, but it's actually selfish? Or like where if you think about it, your intentions aren't what you think they are.
I can take another angle. Like,
Mhm.
even like when we speak, sometimes like the way we express ourselves, like we may have like the best intention, but it may not come out or get portrayed as like we intend to say. And like that can also come as like a wrong, like people may take it incorrectly or wrongly thinking
Yeah.
about it, but like that wasn't our pure intention.
Hmm.
And we were just like solely saying from our heart, and it wasn't like taken in that fashion.
Hmm.
So it's also like similar to like the gift analogy that you were mentioning, but it's more on like the way we speak.
More on the way that we speak. Yeah, and how the way that other people are perceiving that as well. Right.
Exactly.
That checks out.
But again, like I feel like it would be more on a selfless way than a selfish way,
Hmm.
in the sense that you aren't like for even for the gift analogy, like you aren't being selfish. Like you're just giving it from your pure intention and what you think they may like. But if they don't like that is fine, and it's totally fine. Like individuals are different and everybody has their own perspective. So it doesn't necessarily have to be on the same bandwidth, but I would still feel like that's more like a selfless as compared to maybe selfish.
Hmm. But maybe with the traditional connotation of selfless and selfish, if we think about that, there could be like you could be sad because you feel like the other person wasn't necessarily experiencing the emotions that you wanted them to experience, right? From getting the gift, like the happiness and stuff, right? Which is kind of selfless in a way, right? But then there also could be that like you are sad because you didn't get the reaction you were looking for. And then that makes you feel bad about yourself, right? So I think there's like, and again, I don't think any of these are like 100% one way, right? Like it's oftentimes like I feel like intentions are kind of blurred between like, and it's hard to assign percentages, but just like some of it is that, but then some of it's kind of the other thing as well. So I wonder if that's kind of like there is a part of that sadness that comes from what the other person expected that's selfless, but then a part of it that's also selfish. Yeah. Chen.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this counts, but like when I'm doing like side projects or even startups with friends even, like of course we usually start with the problems that we're facing first, like we're making something that we would want for ourselves, like whatever problem that we're facing first ourselves, we're gonna make we're trying to solve that problem, but and we are also really passionate about this entire thing and we find happiness and joy during the process of making this side project and but then when we're done with the project and we kind of present it to other people who we saw would have similar problem and we saw would like the project, and sometimes we get negative feedback to find out that like the demand is actually not real and like people don't really want to use it. Like
Yeah.
getting that feedback is actually like somehow decreasing that the joy and happiness that we have in the process of creating that project, even though like theoretically that's something that like the entire process is something that we're supposed to be passionate about in the first place, and
Hmm.
yet, like the response after we're done with the project still affects how we look at the project afterwards.
Yeah. That makes sense. So there's like in some way or form, there's like an attachment to the outcome of the action, right? So there's something where like that influences how you view the action.
Yeah, yeah.
That makes sense. Does anybody else have anything they wanted to share? Okay, cool. Because I think I have another question right kind of lined up here. Because then the next, especially because we're talking about expectation now when it comes to action, right? And it's like we have an action and we do it, and it's kind of it feels very natural to expect things, right? Because kind of what we were talking earlier, like Trent was saying that like if you're doing an action, then you're, especially if it's forward looking, you're doing it with the intention of some reward in the future, right? So would it be fair to say that, and like oftentimes when that thing doesn't happen, when it doesn't work out, we experience pain, right? It's some sort of like, if it's like that joy of creating that side project, then it's now not the same for you. Now instead you feel just kind of shit. Or like whatever else, like that gift giving example, and now you feel kind of shit. So there's like a certain amount of pain there that feels like it's kind of underlied. So would it be fair to say then, and this is something just to reflect on, that actions cause pain?
Go for it, Trent.
Yeah, Trent.
Sure. Sorry, Rishi, when you say actions, are you referring to the expectations surrounding those actions, or are you referring to the actions themselves?
I think you could even break it down if you like to.
Um, well, specifically, I would think that in this case, since at least how you were speaking before, it sounds like the main cause of the pain you were talking about is from having an expectation, oh, they're going to smile, they're going to enjoy this gift,
Hmm.
and then that not being fulfilled by the action. The actions themselves, to me, at least come across as neutral
Hmm.
because there isn't something inherently good or inherently bad about someone smiling or not smiling or giving a gift or not giving a gift. It's what we're attributing. And the reason why there's subsequently pain is then the expectation related to the action that they're going to smile and they don't. So there's that unmet expectation, which is why I'm wondering if you're when you say action, are you specifically referring to the expectation of how the action is going to go, or are you referring to the action itself? Because if it's the action itself, then I'm a bit confused.
Yeah, because that's where I think the differentiation lies, right? It's like, are we able to split that up between it just being every action causes us pain, or is it just the expectation associated with the action that causes pain, and then that not being met? So that's where I think the kind of discussion point is.
Gotcha. Um, in that case, then just to elaborate one other thing on that note, I don't think it's expectations inherently themselves that necessarily cause pain. It's the inability to let go of expectations when they are unmet.
Mhm.
The main issue, which I see at least with expectations, is when you have an expectation for something, again, going to your gift analogy, someone smiling, then them not smiling, and then basically the pain you're feeling in the present now that they've already not smiled about something in the past. If the expectation is, oh, they're going to smile, they don't smile, and you let go of that expectation as, oh, okay, they didn't smile and move on, then
Mhm.
there's no pain slash no rejection of what the present already is. Fundamentally, expectations don't cause pain on their own, just like having an expectation, because you could expect something good in the future and your expectation could be met and then there's no pain. But not being able to let go of an expectation when something doesn't go your way is where at least I see there being pain.
That makes sense. So then you could see that there's almost like three levels to this. You have like the action, you have the expectation, and then you have the attachment to the expectation. That's kind of that breakdown over there. Where like
Yes,
it's not the action itself that causes pain, but it's related to the expectation of the action, but it's not expectation from the action, but it's not exactly that either. It's that you're attached then to the expectation of the action. So if it doesn't fulfill itself, then there's pain.
correct.
That makes a lot of sense. Anybody else have any reflections, anything they want to share? Anna, go ahead.
I've been trying to figure out how to raise my hand on Zoom for a minute, and I haven't used Zoom in like 3 years, and I could not figure it out. But so you're getting a physical hand raise. Um, I really like that discussion, but I was thinking about it a different way,
Mhm.
and I was thinking that inherently, I guess maybe every action does cause pain to some level. And I think it goes back to our discussion earlier about why are you doing what you're doing.
Mhm.
So like I think you can categorize your actions on a what we were talking about earlier is it like short-term gratification? Am I doing this for the right now, for this moment, or am I doing it because it's giving me some long-term gain? And so if you were doing something for the instant gratification, it's like, okay, great, I feel good right now, but is it making it harder for me to reach my long-term goals? And like what Nishta was saying about, okay, if you're scrolling your phone at night, you feel good right now, and so maybe there isn't immediate pain, but you're reinforcing that habit. So it's giving you pain down the line when you do eventually try to really commit to breaking that habit because you've solidified that habit so much. And then on the flip side, okay, if I force myself to go to bed and not scroll on my phone, this is still a habit that's ingrained in me. So it's causing me pain right now because I'm doing something that goes against my immediate want and my immediate need, but I know it's for my long-term benefit. So the pain is now versus the gain is later. So I guess if you think about it that way, then every action would have pain associated with it, whether it's now or later. So yes, question mark?
Hmm, interesting. So I feel like you can reframe this in terms of expectation as well. Because now this is the flip side, right? Where like something is met, right? So you have an expectation, the
Mhm.
expectation is met. Whether it's like maybe like, oh, you want that little kick from dopamine by scrolling on your Instagram feed, and then
Mhm.
you do it, you get your hit, and you get like in some way or form, is that not also kind of like an expectation being built up for the future? That because I am doing this right now, I am expecting it the next time. But if like my rational mind tries to stop me from doing it, but then in some way, like my brain, like my primal brain is still kind of expecting that dopamine kick. Just like I wonder if that's also can be framed in terms of expectation there. But it's just like rather than it's your rational mind expecting it, it's like it's just your brain expecting it. Yeah,
Yeah, I
Trent.
think.
Sorry, Anna, before.
No. I was in agreement. Go ahead, Trent.
Yeah, if I could elaborate on that, Rishi.
Yeah.
Um, I think what you're saying could be the case, but I also think that not necessarily all pain is caused due to expectations. If you wanted to create like a larger overarching,
Hmm.
I guess, categorization, I think at least for the pain which we're talking about, which is like mental pain that's being caused because people are upset, I think that fundamentally, rather than just coming from expectations, more as an overarching theme comes from a rejection of the present, which I alluded to before,
Hmm.
specifically in the case where if you're talking about like, okay, you're doing XYZ on your phone late at night, and then suddenly like afterwards you pull yourself away and then you're upset because like, hey, I wasted all this time on my phone like late at night and now I'm like sleepy and I feel groggy and like it's a bunch of time wasted or other stuff. There wasn't a conscious expectation set necessarily there, I don't think, so much as it's suddenly getting to the end of this, being now in a present which you don't want to be in, which is again the situation where you stayed up till 3 a.m. whatever browsing TikTok or other stuff,
Hmm.
and then being upset and basically saying, I don't want this present, which is where the pain comes from, I think.
But isn't the expectation there to not have that circumstance in a way? So, like, say again, that example of your phone, right? You scroll till 3 a.m., you wake up the next morning, you're kind of groggy and everything. Like, in some way or form, it's like it is resistance to the present, right? Where you're like, like there was resistance in that moment where you're just scrolling on your phone, but then there's also resistance where it's like instead of accepting your circumstances as is, you're kind of like saying that okay, like I wish it was the alternate outcome where I didn't scroll on my phone, which is also resistance, but it's also like in some way or form you had an expectation. Like I wonder, like, I'm not really able to frame this right now, but like I think it's a bit of both. Like I think you can frame it too in terms of expectation there because you're kind of expecting the like retroactively in a sense from your retroactive behavior you're expecting a different outcome almost or
So if
like
it's
you want that
retroactive,
like you
if it's
want that not
retroactive, oh, sorry.
like you want that to not be the outcome, right? Like it's like you don't want to feel groggy for a past action.
Um, if if that's how you would use expectation there, then I think mainly our disagreement would just come down to semantics.
Hmm.
Specifically, when I was considering expectation, I was thinking of expectation referring explicitly to something in the future, which is why I wasn't categorizing like a want of something in the past to be a different way as an expectation, just because there is that temporal difference. But
Yeah.
if you're using expectation to describe also things in the past, then yeah, I would agree with you.
Hmm. That checks out. Okay, cool. Anybody else have anything they want to share? Any other reflections based off of this? Okay, so we digged in a little bit into, I guess, the nature of expectation. Um, Now I'm going to bring in a little bit of, I guess, Vedic theory into this. Um, so the whole thing of if actions causes pain, it's like in some way or form, you could say the resistance to the present moment. You can say something attached to expectation. And that's where now, and I think in a lot of spirituality, we talk about ego, right? And ego is kind of defined as maybe on a broad level, just anything, our sense of self, essentially, right? Our identity. And the thing is that in circumstances, what like it's defined by, well, I'll actually step a little back. Um, so it's like it's well, actually, so ego is kind of like essentially our identity, right? And it's kind of the ego is defined as the identification of, like, we're identifying with a certain amount of circumstance. Sorry, my mind's a little bit all over the place right now. But so actually give me one quick second to think this through. So yes, anyways, so what I was saying was the sense of attachment, right? The attachment comes in a sense from a sense of self, right? Which is what we in spirituality is defined as the ego, our sense of self, essentially. Now, in Hindu philosophy, when we talk about our sense of self, right? I think I remember at the beginning of the first lecture, I was asking about what do you think when you think of yourselves, right? What is ultimately the self, which is ultimately what this Hindu philosophy and Hinduism as a whole is trying to answer, right? So in Hindu philosophy, there's the belief that we are not just what we identify with. And that is kind of ties in with all of this. So I want you to think maybe to, and this is probably not organized the best way, but I want you to maybe take like another minute to reflect on something you strongly identify with, right? And I want you to see how much of that is kind of like, and like maybe let's say it's like a behavior trait, right? Or maybe it's like a role. Like let's say you view yourself as someone that's super intelligent, or maybe you view yourself as like I don't know, whatever thing. It could be like you're the funny one in the group, or maybe it's like you have a certain amount of wealth or whatever it is. How much of that do you think for that circumstance is intrinsic versus driven by circumstance? So I'll give you a minute to think about it. Just pick one example. And we can just maybe talk through a few. And I'll also type this up in the chat.
Rishi, are you specifically looking for traits we identify with, or just identifications in general? Because, for example, like I would identify as being male, but I don't think that's really like circumstantial necessarily.
Yeah, so that would be something that's kind of intrinsic naturally. I would say something that's more like, yeah, I'd say maybe traits or maybe like roles almost that you take on in society as an example, like your job as an example, or maybe personality traits, things like that. I'll maybe actually, does anyone want to go first? If not, I can get started. Yeah, Chang, go ahead.
Sure. So it was about like 2 years ago. I was a little lost, and then I was like desperately looking for something to be like working on to just to like do something. And then a friend who invited me to kind of help him out on his little side project and startup.
Mhm.
And like ever since from then I got into the tech industry and has been in it until now. But like at this point I sometimes look back and I keep asking myself, like if it wasn't that friend, if it was another friend, another mentor throwing me an invitation to another project in another industry, like maybe like inviting me to like a drama production, like something like that. I don't know. Like if that was the case, would I still be in the tech industry? So like I ask myself that a lot. So like I'm not sure if I'm like doing what I'm doing right now because that's what I'm actually passionate about, or only because like this just happened to be the way it is. And I want to say that I'm doing this intrinsically, but I don't think I've ever really had a chance to kind of like drop everything to go back and like start from the beginning, starting from nothing to figure out like what path am I going to end up choosing.
Hmm. So you could say that some of that like is kind of boils down to circumstance. So circumstantial in nature that you are in this field, or maybe even that like whether this is a passion or not intrinsically is like where I guess the question mark kind of lies.
Yes. Yes.
That makes sense. Cool. Anybody else? Okay, maybe I'll go next then. So I was thinking for myself, right? And I've always from well when I feel like when I was young, I had like a pretty healthy ego in like the more traditional sense. Like I was very I think egotistic about being very smart in school because I'd always get these like high grades in elementary school and things like that. I honestly used to think that everybody else around me was kind of an idiot. So I always thought I was smart, but then now if I think about it, right? I kind of realize that it's some of it is probably genetic, right? That there's a certain cognitive ability. Some of it is definitely the fact that I got the right circumstances around me, the right parents who emphasized education, the right teachers around me, and even a marking that kind of geared towards what my natural strengths were. And like if I was the same person genetically, just put in a different part of the world, then maybe I wouldn't have been able to achieve the same things academically that I did otherwise. And so that like even that thing that for me is like, oh, I'm so smart, is like a lot of it is kind of conditional or driven by circumstance for me. So that was something that I kind of like realized. Um, so yeah, that's kind of my example. Yeah, Trent.
Yeah. Yeah, your example actually resonates a lot with me, Rishi. Specifically, just thinking back to my past. Originally, when I'd grown up, I'd not been in the best circumstances, specifically with the school I was attending. There were a lot of issues there, both in terms of supervision, but also just specifically the class I got had a bunch of kids who had a lot of behavioral issues. And as a consequence of that, back in like earlier elementary school, I was getting in tons of fights. I was basically entirely behind on all of my school stuff, had been part of kind of the equivalent of, I guess, what you would consider an elementary school gang group or whatever else, and was definitely a delinquent and by all standards one of the quote unquote bad kids or dumb kids, etc. But in changing that environment and getting pulled out and then shifted to a different school, having then like some tutors and mentors and other stuff to change my life and fundamental path where I am now. In college, I'm like taking all these different courses, getting straight A's, etc. And I can definitely say that like where I am right now, I'm identifying and thinking like, oh yeah, I think I'm pretty smart, or I think I like understand all these things, and I'm definitely understanding them at like a higher level here or other stuff. I definitely think that what you said about like that being attributed or possibly attributed to largely environmental circumstances and other stuff, at least in my life, applies a lot because I think that if I was just staying at that other school and hadn't gotten pulled out and hadn't gotten like the separate tutors and mentors and other stuff to get me on a better path, I would definitely not be where I am right now.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I guess you've seen kind of both sides of it, right? And that's kind of it's interesting to see that and to reflect upon that. Because right now we haven't even taken into the account that we're right now assuming like some of our abilities and like what we say are, like kind of intrinsic to us are also just conditioned on like a genetic ability or just where we were like in terms of that. And like even that to an extent, if you think about it, is kind of circumstance because it's like we didn't choose that we'll be born over here or we'll grow up with these set of circumstances. So even like just where we're born itself is kind of like driven by circumstance too. So then the question then is like we tend to identify with like all these different things, right? Like, oh, like I'm smart, I'm this, I'm that. But like kind of at an intrinsic level, that's all dictated by circumstance. So what we construct our identities to be are kind of like very circumstantial driven, right? And the question that was kind of like obviously like something that drives me very internally and something that obviously a lot of sages had the question is like if we can kind of if it's something that's so driven by circumstance, right? Then that cannot be the core self, right? That there needs to be something else that's the core self. So there is something beyond, I guess, just what we perceive to be ourselves, our identity. There's something else beyond that that's ourselves, is kind of what I'm trying to get at. And that's what Patanjali was talking about when he talked about the identification of the seer with the seen, right? That our circumstances and all these things are kind of what created us, give us even like the thoughts that we think today. So much of it are dictated by what we heard when we were younger or what schools we went to, what things we learned, what books we read, all these things. And that's all kind of like here referred to as a scene. But then there's a seer and a scene is what he defined. And like the identification of the seer with the scene. So us kind of just viewing ourselves in terms of our identities is what ego essentially is. Now, how does this tie with what was kind of mentioned earlier when we were talking about like why do we act and the sense of ego and actions causing us pain and expectation and all of that is it's believed that that identification of the seer with the scene, so that ego essentially is what also attaches and latches onto things. And that's where our sense of pain is kind of derived from. So that expectation is in a sense kind of like that attachment comes from our ego. Now, naturally, the ego is not necessarily something that's all bad, right? It's like if you didn't have an ego, if you didn't have a sense of self, right? Now, imagine you're just like, technically, you just wouldn't really care about if you were alive or not. You just like be in kind of like this state of being, like, what is the self or what are you then, right? And so the ego isn't necessarily an enemy in this circumstance. It's just kind of like we see ourselves as just our identities, just what we perceive to be, which ultimately kind of boil down to our circumstance. So that's kind of what the reflection was. And that led to this concept over here of the Atman. So the jiva Atma and the Param Atma. Now, the jiva Atma is kind of defined as like the individual self or the soul, right? And it's essentially this indivisible unit of you that doesn't change. And it's not influenced by circumstances, it's not influenced by anything else around you. So it's not your identity, it's not your ego. And the biggest the easiest way to understand it is again like this the soul or basically like your individual consciousness. And that's what is referred to as kind of the seer. Now, in Vedic philosophy, especially in certain schools, it's believed that like then you're like it's kind of like the soul or the individual self has like this layer that's kind of covering it from seeing its real reality, right? And that is the body, the mind, and the ego. So those three things are kind of like where like we on our day to day we kind of identify with these things and we see ourselves as just oh we're a physical body we're gonna die we have a mind, we think things, and we have an ego. This is who I am. And this is all that we are. So that's kind of what the jiva atma is. Now, the param atma is kind of what you could say it's similar to what most religions refer to as God. But there's literally no human attributes to this. So it's like anything that you kind of imagine it to be is like limiting it in perspective. So it's considered the supreme self or the universal kind of consciousness. It's also referred to as a Brahman, but that's basically the kind of like the ultimate reality of the universe. So it's like this universal kind of like all pervading consciousness that exists. Now, in Vedic philosophy, especially the yoga school, the goal of the jiva atma or the soul is to transcend the individuality, and to realize its unity with the supreme with the supreme self, essentially. So that's kind of what the perspective is. And how do you kind of do that? It's kind of by, over a point, starting to let go of your attachment to that identity, letting go of your attachment to circumstances around you and to the outcome, expectations of outcomes. And you start to slowly let go of that grasp to, this is what this is who I am. And eventually, according to the yogic sages and so on, you reach this point of just simply being or existing. So now I've brought this here just for a little bit of context, but different schools kind of view these, like the jiva atma, or you could say like the individual self, and almost maybe for the sake of making it easier, I'll just say God. So the individual self and God in different ways. Um, in the Advaita school, right? It's basically said that each soul is identical. So there's nothing that's actually separate between my soul and say like Nishta soul. Like it's identically the same thing. It's one consciousness, and it's the same thing as the universal, the supreme self. And I had an analogy that I think like kind of like made it easier for me to understand. And it's kind of just like, imagine like different, like imagine you're having a dream, right? And in that dream, let's say you're imagining someone else. Maybe you're imagining people that actually exist. It's from your day. People that you know, maybe your parents, maybe friends, and so on. It's not technically your friends that are actually in your dreams, right? It's just like your consciousness kind of like shaping in the form of your friend. And that's what's kind of going on in your dream. So in the same way, it's like take that a level up to reality, where it's like now like everyone is actually just kind of like one consciousness, but just in different forms. And that's kind of the viewpoint of the Advaita school. Now, the Dvaita school, which Advaita basically means one, Dvaita means two, or like the duality, where that's where each jiva atma or each soul is unique. So my soul is different from Nishta's soul, from Anna's soul, and so on. And it's kind of dependent on the Paramatma, or it's dependent on God. So this these schools do have a different viewpoint from the Buddhist schools, because I think in in Buddhism they have like this view of, I think it's called anatta, or like nothingness, non-self, essentially, where there's like no unchanging self, and kind of everything is like chalked up to like conditions. It's like everything is kind of conditional. If we go back to that question of um how much is it of it is intrinsic or driven by circumstance, it's like everything that you identify with is driven by circumstance, to the point that even you are kind of driven by circumstance. So there's like an idea of like the non-self over there. So I guess that's something to kind of leave you off with to reflect on a little bit. That, do you think that there's a self? And is there a higher reality? And are they separated? So that's just something for you to reflect on. And maybe we can just think about that for a moment and then kind of like answer accordingly. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I had a question. So is para ama like a higher level of being that's within every individual, or is that like a universal seeing, like that there's only one out there in the entire world per se?
So that's where there's like different viewpoints of it, right? It's
Uh,
kind of viewed as like it is viewed as consciousness essentially. It's like pure unpervading consciousness, the same thing that kind of gives us like an awareness of just reality. But it's like separated. Like there's different viewpoints of it where it's like in certain schools it's viewed that that's like essentially everything, that there's nothing differentiating us, and essentially we are that as well. But then there's certain schools where it's kind of like the individual soul versus, like, that analogy between the individual soul and God is kind of like a more apt representation of like what the Param Atma is. Yeah, Anna, go ahead.
Still can't figure out how to raise my hand on here, but that's okay. Um, I guess I never realized that there were multiple schools of thought on this. The reality, or I guess the way that I've always seen it based on what I've heard from my parents and my grandparents and things like that, is that like, or at least the way that I view the world is that we are our own being, that it's not one universal collective, but that we are our own. Like I have my own Paramatma, and then I think it's like the way I view it is that my Paramatma would be my ideal self. It would be like if I have if I go through my life and I learn all the lessons that the universe wants me to learn, and that like I go through the motions and I grow and I become this elevated being, that I would then become, and I would merge into my Paramatma. I would become this like ideal version of myself.
Mm.
And so,
But would you still maintain your individuality in that?
yes, yeah, because I don't think that if we like, I think if you go through your life and you learn all the lessons you're supposed to learn and all the things, I think if we both become our most actualized, realized selves, I don't think we would be the same person. I still think we would be two completely different souls because we have different purposes in our individual lives. So I don't think we're all like trying to merge into one like one piece of a much larger puzzle. I think we are our own puzzles.
Mm. That makes sense. And then that would align a little bit more with the Dwaita school of thought.
Hmm.
Does anybody else have want to share?
Yeah, actually, if you wouldn't mind, sorry, I didn't catch the participant's name who just shared, but
Yeah.
I was curious, just based on what you were saying there, you were talking about basically realizing the whatever universe's all of the universe's greatest lessons in order to become the, I guess for lack of better words, best or realized version of yourself. But then we're still talking about differences between individual people.
Hmm.
Um, when I'm hearing that, to me, that sounds like that would inherently imply that there's different lessons that different people would learn. Is that what you're saying, or am I?
Uh, yeah, I am. And I think maybe there's a more fundamental discussion here about, do you think that souls move from body to body and through lives? Because again, this goes back to like what I've learned from my parents and like everything that I've heard growing up, which is I guess what I've just internalized and used with my belief system. But I believe that your soul moves over lifetimes. So the lessons that I'm talking about are karmas that I've racked up from previous lives where maybe I was a bad person, maybe I hurt someone else, maybe I did something bad. And so in this lifetime, when my soul moves to this body, I have to rectify those wrongs. I have to learn my lessons, and I have to grow and become a person that doesn't do those negative things. So that's what I'm referring to in terms of learning my lessons, is becoming a version of myself that is the ideal version based on my previous actions, not necessarily just in this life, but previous lives as well.
Gotcha. So you're talking about rectifying specifically like negatives or other stuff you've done in your past, and if we're going on your system, it sounds like then um, everyone has these like negatives in their past lives which they've encountered and need to rectify. So I'm curious then if there's still a difference in terms of what the ultimate realized best version of the person or each person would be. Do those lessons then differ? Is there a difference in morality in terms of what needs to be corrected?
I guess that comes full circle to this discussion, right? Like, do we all have one version of what is the most actualized reality, or are there multiple? I think there are multiple. I think as a soul that you, because as you move through your lives, you're picking up good and bad karma as you go as well, right? Because like from your day-to-day actions, you making that lasagna, like all the little things add up. And so I think that there is an ideal version of my soul, but it's not the same as the ideal version of your soul. Not that one is better than the other. I think they are just different. It's like when people have different value systems, it's like, I'm not going to say your value system's wrong. It's just different than mine. But if you really value, experiences and time, and somebody else really values gifts and objects, not necessarily that one is better than the other. We can have different opinions, but that doesn't mean that the intrinsic value of those things is different. Of
Interesting. Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying.
course, yeah. I love this discussion. I'll hand it off to someone else. I've been yapping for too long.
Yeah, I was just gonna bring another perspective. Like for me, like I'm just saying from personal perspective, but for me, it's like Paramatma is like the supreme, like how we have been sort of like brought up. Like it's kind of like the supreme God, where like that's like the best version or the ideal version, and then your Jivatma is like maybe like your core. So you're taking some pieces from the Paramatma, which I guess like people say like you come to this world to like make some actions and like there are like certain contributions that every person has in this world. So your Jivatma could be only like those contributions, but again, in your actual life, you can go in tangent direction and do wrong stuff. And so you're kind of like going through, as Anna was mentioning, like you kind of go through different cycles of life to go to that like the proper or the realized version. But again, like it's very different from Atma.
Hmm, that makes sense. I can maybe share my perspective as well. Just this is just an individual perspective. And like so for me, I find like I like to base what I understand based off of whatever I've observed. And for me, the means of observation was like meditation. And not that I went to like a full level of depth in meditation, but in a couple experiences, I had points where like the like my individual self and like the surrounding, how I describe it, kind of started to blur. Um, and so my observation from that, I still had awareness of self, but if I were to like kind of extrapolate on that and assume things based off of that, then for me it would be that like there is like essentially the essence of being enlightened or self-actualized would be a degree of unity, right? There'd just be unity. There wouldn't be the dualities that kind of create life. So even like the concepts of right or wrong, all these things would just kind of like not exist at that level. It would just be a state of being almost. But that's just on a soul level. But then whether that's like an individual soul or actually like everyone is just one consciousness, I kind of lean towards everyone is one consciousness. Um, but there's no evidence backing or not backing that. There's nothing I can observe that can make me feel that way other than the fact that like I've seen that like kind of like blurring of like the self and the other. And if there's blurring of the self and the other, then if at the end then there's no difference between both of them, then that would be kind of like that experience, or that's what I would assume in that moment. Um, and then afterwards, based off of that, so I think she just dropped off. But then kind of based off of that, like as far as like the form, like you can be in an actualized state where I guess we'll talk about karma more in like future lectures, but like at that point, then karma is kind of like your actions aren't generating karma, despite like actually being there, despite you actually still physically acting. Um, and then at that point, it's just like because there's still different forms and everything is still the same, I guess, essence. That's why things look different. That's why we have different like ways that we interpret things and so on. It's like bringing something so that's so like it's just unity, right? There's no like observed and no seer and no like seen at that point, right? Just everything's kind of just fused together. So then how do you like bring that into words? How do you bring that into a world of dualities? Let me open it up to Anna.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up question for you. But this kind of goes back to what Trent was asking earlier. So since in your view we are a combined consciousness, then is there one actualized version of a person? Are we all the same when we are the most actualized versions of ourselves? Or are we still individuals? How do you see it?
I think it's kind of like waves in the ocean, right? Where it's like each of them may have different form, but like at their essence, they're just ultimately all water. So we may appear as individuals, but like because the essence of us is all water, when we realize that, then there's that there doesn't feel to be any difference between them. It's just kind of like more on like a physical level, or just in the medium that we operate in.
Right, okay. So it's like we can hold the same values, but maybe we have different hobbies. And
Like
we
yeah,
like we spend our time doing different things in the physical world, but inherently at a very core level, we are the same.
yes.
Right. Cool.
Ryan, you raised your hand up as well.
Yeah, but doesn't that technically mean you should always, so everybody should actually do like the same actions?
No, not
So like
necessarily.
they're like the same, right? Like they're like still part of like they both have react like this. They should react the same way. They should like walk the same way. Because like they're still part of like the sameness, right? Like the way I kind of like to think from is like the water analogy, like ocean makes sense, but think about it from like a earth, like a at the core, it's like still like all same, but then in the surface there's like land, water, there's like mountains and all like different stuff, right?
Hmm.
So
So maybe even taking that like wave analogy a little bit further, right? It's like everything at its core is water, but not every wave is going to operate the same way, even if all the core is water, right? Waves may operate in different ways. One may crash a little before, the other one may like be a different shape, do all these different things, right? So it's like that's kind of dictated by the circumstance almost that that's in and the form that's created. So there's like the form which is how we're kind of operating in the world that we're operating in, but the form, but then there's like the formless, right? Or essence, like that core unity. So despite them all being like water at their essence, it's like it's kind of still materializing in different ways. Yes, Trent.
Yeah, actually, in that case, if you're opening the doors to the possibility of different materializations of more, I guess, or less fundamental properties, it sounds like you and I believe Anna uh, are actually on the same page then, because from my understanding of what she was saying, um, there are still like some moral ideas and different lessons which are maybe more core. For example, you could take something, I guess, to quote like Bible or whatever, like "Thou shalt not kill,"
Hmm.
etc., which you could apply to everyone. But still, when it comes down to the minutia of what actually manifests as each individual person, you have like different hobbies and other stuff which are more neutral. And when you're talking about like waves or other stuff and everything being water, maybe a good analogy in that case would be like, sure, the water is kind of like that core sense of like very simple morality that binds us, but then the different manifestations of each waves can be like those hobbies and other stuff, in which case, again, it sounds like you guys are on the same page to me, if I'm understanding your perspectives correctly.
But I would say that like if you reach a point of like not like non-self, then what is like what is morality even at that point, at that level, at that spiritual, at that soul level, right? That's more of just in the physical world, right? And then there's like, but I'd say like at that like, because then there's no self. So then what are you imposing morality on? If we're talking about like morality as an example, there's like definitely operating in the physical world, there's like a need for morality and all these other things. But at that level, when you're like, when it's just like one consciousness, then there's no two parties that you're like, one is imposing something on the other. So morality wouldn't even be like an absolute construct. It's kind of like a construct of dualities. No?
So at that level, wouldn't you then be talking about losing entirely your individuality? If there is no self, then there would be no differentiation between like your waves analogy, which you were talking about before.
Um, like it's just a difference in terms of like at least, and again, this is all hypothetical, right? Because none of us have experienced this. But like you can still be actualized and realize your essence to be water, but like because it's manifested for whatever reason in all these different forms that we're still experiencing like through that like our color or lens which from which we view that light is different, and that's why there appears to be differences, if that makes sense. So even if you're still operating in the physical world, I think at your core, then technically yes, there would be like nothing, you just like be, right? But like at the physical level, then you're kind of just like, because of that there's still, I guess, differences, or so to say. Like I would feel that at that point you'd still like kind of tangentially hold on to a concept of an ego or a sense of self. Um, because if you didn't, then there would be like you just there would be nothing, if that makes sense. You wouldn't be able to interact in the real world. And like one thing I've noticed, if that makes and this is just like from other people that have kind of interacted with spiritual masters. So like people that have been believed to be enlightened, they're like, I think there's been a point where like they kind of just die at their final enlightenment point. Like it's just believed to be like death. Like if you take someone like Swami Vivekanand, for example, like even like if you ask followers, like they kind of like sensed in like the few days before that like he's just gonna like be, and like I think in true enlightenment, if you wanted to maintain or just stay in an enlightened state, then there wouldn't be like you wouldn't be able to exist in the physical world, essentially. So it might be like something that you like operate in, or like you experience states of until you truly want to like until it's like you truly like just enter that state, and then at that point there's no you.
Okay. So at the final state, ultimate highest state of enlightenment, there is no you. There's no individuality in terms of opinions, other stuff, etc. Is your belief?
Yeah, of
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
course. I know this conversation got a little like very, very deep very quickly, but does anybody else have anything they kind of wanted to share?
Yeah, I think I also agree with you, like Rishabh, on the final part, like on the enlightenment piece, like you just become one,
Mm.
and there is like no difference, like no body, no soul, like you're just part of the same, everything is just like same, regardless of like there's no think. I wouldn't say it's thinking, but it's more like there's no differences between any individual. Like you're just kind of just like a very pure soul, like purest of pure.
Yeah, like there's no form, there's no thought, there's no mind, there's no observer, no observed. It's just like all the dualities that we kind of operate within life are kind of just like flattened out into this like one thing, just unity, I guess. And that kind of leads me to this one saying, or this one verse from one of the Upanishads. And this is kind of the essence of that teaching, where it just says that you are that. And that's the verse. You are that. That's it. So just I think a good place to leave off on. And actually one final thing I wanted to add before we just hop into a quick 10-minute meditation or so is, where is this here? Okay. So now defining the word yoga, right? So yoga comes from the word yuj, which means to unite. And in this context, right, if you think of the entire discussion that we've had, um, the ultimately the ultimate unity essentially is one where you've kind of realized that you're not the body, mind, and ego. You recognize your true nature. So kind of similar to what I was talking about, that nature of like duality, kind of like flattening out into this thing of just unity. And yoga, under that perspective, could be defined as ultimately just pathways to that ultimate unity. So it's not just the obviously like we are very familiar in the West with like the physical actions, which is often referred to as like hatha yoga, right? But the whole purpose of yoga is kind of pathways to the ultimate unity, which you could call enlightenment, you can call moksha, nirvana, all these other things. So that's kind of what yoga is defined as. So with that, we'll kind of end off today in terms of like discussion and all these things. I appreciate everyone obviously participating and sharing their opinions. I think that's ultimately what makes this what it is. And obviously, I'm not like some realized master or anything like this. So it's good to have these conversations. It's good to talk to people about these things and just reflect on these just for your own life as well. What we'll do is we'll do a meditation now. And for today's meditation, what I will do, we'll again keep it simple because I know we also only have a few minutes. Um, I'm just gonna play a recording of like one of the Om chanting, and I'm gonna introduce this as basically mantra meditation. So the purpose of mantra meditation is essentially like ultimately meditation at its core is kind of controlling the thought forms of the brain, right? Now, until you're at a state where you're just kind of like in the state of being. But that is very, very difficult to do when you're getting started. So, one of the ways that were kind of devised by the ancient sages was you can repeat a word, and that word often has some degree of significance. And we can talk about that. But ultimately, you're repeating a word to try to bring your attention to that word. And by repeating it and bringing your attention to that over a period of time, you make your mind kind of one pointed in nature, where it's just like a form of like extreme focus. So that's what we'll be kind of just like experiencing today. So we won't be chanting ourselves, but we'll just be listening to this and we'll just try to focus on the word itself. So we're using the word Om for today, and that's just what all the chanting is. Om is believed to be the sound made during creation. So it's like technically it's like made of three parts, like ah, o, which is like also kind of synonymous with your mouth going from like closed to fully open and then kind of closing again. So there's a bunch of significance associated with that, but we'll be listening to that and then meditating. I'll also stop the recording now.